Human history isn't all sunshine and rainbows. In fact, 99% of the time, it's just human beings figuring out horrific ways to treat each other, and eventually we glorify it. History is full to the brim with cruelty, and nothing in history was more cruel than a medieval dungeon. The WWE may have hell in a cell, but the Middle Ages, well, they took that term literally. There are places in history where even the darkness dare tread, and one of those places would be the Oubliette. Any second now, I should be getting that all-important first sponsor, but until then, you can help support me and this channel by liking, subscribing, sharing, and tapping that bell icon to get notified whenever I upload. If you'd like to drop in some extra support, you can become a patron and get access to these videos 48 hours early. Anyways, on with the video. The name oubliette is actually derived from a French word oublier, which is a verb meaning to forget. As the name suggests, once a prisoner was thrown into an oubliette, they were forgotten. An oubliette is a small bricked or concreted room that is only accessible via a small hole that is covered with either a trapdoor, gate or hatch. Sometimes called a bottle dungeon, prisoners would be lowered into the oubliette via a rope or a ladder that would be pulled up behind them if they weren't just thrown in. In some cases, these rooms were so small the only movement available to these prisoners would be to tilt their head up as their last glimmer of freedom slammed shut behind them. An oubliette didn't actually have to be inside a castle and could be part of a separate structure which would just add to the isolation. On the inverse of this, sometimes the oubliette would be built within the upper walls of the castle, so the unfortunate prisoner would have to hear the day-to-day goings-on of the castle as they themselves starved to death in a cold, damp, dark container where they could barely move, sometimes being forced to stand or crouch 24 hours a day. In many oubliettes, the previous occupants were often just left there to rot and to feed the castle's rat population, so the next prisoner would often find themselves with something squelching underfoot, surrounded by piles of bones, and of course, have rats running over them. And on the odd occasion, raw sewage. It's highly unlikely that there's any oubliettes out there with 5 stars on TripAdvisor. The oubliette is thought to have originated from French castles during the High Middle Ages and was most prevalent during the High and Late Middle Ages between 1100 CE and 1500 CE. The primary purpose of an oubliette, aside from forgetting a prisoner and easily unaliving them, was psychological torture. Depending on when and where you were stuck in an oubliette, you may find yourself laying down as excrement from the castle's inhabitants flooded down onto you, or you may find yourself standing until you left this plane of existence. Or you may find yourself crouching with absolutely no room to lay down or stand. And still have the poop and the rats and the other people's bodies. What's worse is before you even got into the oubliette, you may have had other torture methods thrust upon you, or when you got out of the oubliette, the only reason was because they wanted to torture you some more. Imagine a scenario where you're pulled up from the pitch black abyss, the cold castle wall scratching at your back as your rotting feet are gnawed at by rats amongst the stinking flesh of a previous prisoner, only to be fastened into the rack. Imagine brief glimpses of freedom meaning only more pain. Now, you would assume only the worst of the worst criminals would find themselves in the oubliette, but more often than not, soldiers, political rivals, and sometimes innocent people who just happened to be on the wrong side of a war or feud would find themselves in these horrific dungeons. In some cases, prisoners would be given just enough food and water to survive in the oubliette. This would be done either for interrogations or simply to prolong the suffering of the prisoner, sometimes for months, sometimes even for years. The Angstloch or fear hole was the German version of the oubliette, although oubliette-style prison cells were used more recently in Germany. Like the oubliette, the Angstloch was covered with a trapdoor or gate, but unlike the oubliette, there tended to be a bit more of a distance between the floor and the entrance. And in some cases, prisoners were just thrown in. If you survived the fall, you would be in agony, at the very bare minimum if you didn't have any severe injuries. Even then, the most you'd be able to do would be look up as the trapdoor or gate shut behind you, and there was very, very little chance that you were getting out. But there's a little bit more room in an Angstloch, so silver linings. As with the oubliette, you weren't alone in an Angstloch, and you had some lovely rats to keep you company, as well as your fellow prisoners who had been there a while. Angstlochs were also used for storage, especially for weapons and ammunition such as projectiles and stones that could be placed inside and lifted out with a pulley system. In more recent times, the Nazis would utilise a sort of oubliette called a standing cell or a Stehbunker in their concentration camps. They also weren't the only ones during the 20th century to do this, as South American dictator Augusto Pinochet may have used similar cells during his regime. One of the victims of the standing cells, named Newman, was stuck inside for 192 hours, pushing him to the point of near insanity. In fact, there were many cases of people being stuck in the standing cells and just passing out. Some of these cells were so small it can only be compared to being stuck in a chimney for weeks on end. Some would be given bread every 3 days, and others, like those trapped in the infamous Block 11 in Auschwitz, would be lucky if they received food at all, with some prisoners saying they received only 3 meals during their entire time stuck in the standing cells. In fact, one prisoner was forced to eat his own shoes. The other person who invaded Poland in the onset of World War II, Joseph Stalin and Soviet Russia, would also have some of these horrific cells, but they were known as Kishka. Going back to the medieval period, we head over to Pontefract Castle, which was dismantled by Oliver Cromwell in 1649, a man who you would most likely see on a Tuesday. Cromwell hated Pontefract Castle as it was one of the last royalist strongholds to surrender. The nearby locals were all too happy to help Cromwell out by petitioning Parliament for its destruction, as invading armies on their way to the castle would often sack their towns. Hidden within the ruins, however, the dungeon and oubliette are still mostly intact, as if the dark bowels of this ancient historic building are just simply waiting for its next occupant. On the border between medieval England and medieval Scotland, Edward I, also known as the Hammer of the Scots, utilised Chillingham Castle, which was originally a monastery. He specifically used Chillingham's dungeons to imprison spies and soldiers, and not just them, but the women and the children. He would torture these poor souls, breaking their arms and legs before throwing them into the dungeon. They would be thrown down 20 feet into the cold, damp, rat-infested dungeon with only a single trap door to let in any light. Very quickly, starvation set in, and many resorted to eating their own flesh to survive. Allegedly, around 7,500 Scottish prisoners would pass away at Chillingham, their bodies being dumped into the lake. Conwy Castle was built when Edward I was busy subjugating the Welsh between 1283 and 1287. Just off of the main hall of the castle is Prison Tower, and here you could actually get some comfier cells. They had, say, a bed or a chair. At least it's cheaper than uni accommodation. Below these, however, was a 12-foot deep, inescapable dungeon with only a trap door in or out. Back up north, St Andrew's Castle, which was originally built during the 12th century and changed hands several times during the Scottish Wars of Independence, had a little horror of its own. In the northwest corner of the castle, there is a sea tower, and on its upper floor there was some nice comfy guest accommodation, but on the ground floor there was 2 chambers. One contained a narrow slit for ventilation along the eastern wall, and the other contained a bottle dungeon, 24 feet deep, narrow at the top, but wide at the bottom. There was only one entrance and exit, only one light source, and absolutely no hope of escape from the seaside pit of despair. At Pembroke Castle in 1440, John Whithorn was stripped naked and thrown into the castle's oubliette. This was done on the orders of the Duke of Gloucester and the Earl of Pembroke, Humphrey of Lancaster. Of course, it was someone from the House of Lancaster. Whithorn would eventually go blind and was starved not only of food but of any mental stimulation other than the cold and the pain. Warwick Castle was built in 1068 under the orders of William the Conqueror, otherwise known as William the Bastard, Godwinson for life. An oubliette was built into the castle that was so small its victims were unable to stand nor lay down, their only option being to crouch. During the 100 Years' War, when Warwick Castle was home to French prisoners, French soldiers would tell each other horror stories of Warwick Castle's oubliette in France. That's how terrifying Warwick Castle's oubliette was. The oubliette was designed to be as uncomfortable as possible, with cold, jagged stones thrusting out from the walls at random intervals and only a few inches keeping your head from the ceiling, or rather the gate. But don't think that's going to get you out easier, because now you've just got a cold metal gate on your head that you can't get out of. Because there's no room to lift your arms up to lift the gate, which would obviously be locked anyways, but imagine being that close to freedom. Oh. I'm not even claustrophobic, and I'm feeling claustrophobic just talking about this. When you think about it, Warwick Castle's oubliette, and many oubliettes like it, were just small stone coffins. Man-made horrors beyond human comprehension. A little later in history, there would be another famous oubliette in the Tower of London, known as Little Ease. No bigger than a small cupboard, again this cell had nowhere near enough room for you to stand up properly or to lay down, again forcing you to crouch for 24 hours a day, normally after severe torture from the rack and any other horrific thing they could come up with at the time. This was less about you unaliving in Little Ease, more Little Ease was designed to get a confession out of you. So after your ligaments, muscles and bone had been stretched, snapped and broken, you would be forced into Little Ease. In fact, Little Ease actually got its name from the fact that it granted little ease from the torture. In 1534, a yeoman warder, or a beefeater as they're known more colloquially, was caught with a thief known as Alice Tankerville. His name was John Board, and he had fallen deeply in love with Alice, deciding to help her escape. When he was caught, he was tortured on the rack for his betrayal, and then thrown into Little Ease, broken and beaten. To make things worse, he was later thrown over the tower walls in chains to be picked at by the ravens and attacked by the elements. Understandably, he eventually confessed and was hung, whilst Alice was hung into the Thames at low tide and drowned. There's actually a good chance that the famous Guy Fawkes was thrown into Little Ease, and if he was, there's actually a sizable chance he was its last inhabitant. In fact, another stupendously fun fact for you, Guy Fawkes was tortured so badly that allegedly he could barely sign his own name on his own confession. Now, much like the life of Diogenes, we don't know exactly where Little Ease is. It may be in the White Tower, which now hosts part of a gift shop, but it may also be in the old Flint Tower. Either way, it may have just been torn down or bricked up to, well, hide its horrors from the world. Sometimes cold stone and being forced into a crouched position around rotting bodies wasn't enough, and the person taking you prisoner wanted to add a little spice. One spicy example is the Oubliette in Lep Castle, or that name in Irish Gaelic, which I'm not even going to try and pronounce because it's just going to come off as straight up offensive. The castle itself has an incredibly bloody history and is said to be one of the most haunted locations in Ire. Built around 1250, the castle has seen its fair share of battles, sieges and the occasional massacre. Held alternatively between the O'Bannon and the O'Carroll clans, rival clan members would more often than not find themselves in the castle's oubliette. The unfortunate prisoner would find themselves thrown into the oubliette, and then the second they hit the bottom, they would find themselves severely injured. Why? Because the floor of the oubliette had several large wooden spikes. This means that the prisoner would be stuck there, impaled, unable to move as their life ebbed away slowly in the cold and the dark. And if that wasn't enough, there was a small opening into a ditch which suggests that at times the oubliette may have been flooded. Over 150 people are said to have been found in Lep Castle's oubliette, and apparently it took 3 cartloads to remove all of the bodies during renovations in the 1920s. In 2009, an oubliette was discovered in Nottingham under the Galleries of Justice, and it is suspected that the famous outlaw Robin Hood was kept there. Germany and the British Isles were not the only homes of man-made horrors beyond human comprehension. There is a very deep and complex oubliette in the Château de Pierrefonds in France. Of course, there is an oubliette inside the famous Bastille, but it has been put forward that this was just simply a room for storing ice. In fact, it has actually been put forward that some of the oubliettes in Ire were just simple sewers, although, knowing the human race, it wouldn't surprise me if we had combined the two. In modern-day Turkey, in Istanbul, which was once known as Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, otherwise known as the Byzantine Empire, sits the Rumeli Hisari, or the Boğaz Kesin Hisari, or Throat Cutter Castle. On the 6th floor of the Black Tower within the fortress, there is a doorway in which prisoners would be pushed through and then have a 15-foot drop where they would land and become a permanent fixture of the fortress. So there you have it, the oubliette, one of the most horrific ways to pass on in human history. Man-made horrors beyond human comprehension aside, I hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know in the comments below if you did or if you didn't. Let me know if I missed anything or if I got anything wrong, or just let me know what you'd like to see next. Now, to give you a visual example of what an oubliette was like. Okay guys, so now we've reached the end of the video, the spectacular hidey hole of a video. So now to truly represent the fear that would have gone for you as you've just come off of the rack. Your ligaments have been snapped and stretched and bent in ways that physically shouldn't be possible unless you're in a kink dungeon. Now, this part wouldn't be pleasant, so we're going to try and, I'm going to try and demonstrate what it would be like to go into an oubliette using a cardboard box. Now, this isn't going to go off exactly as it would, it's not made of stone, but it can give you some idea and perhaps laugh at my misfortune as I go into the box. Now, it's pretty dark in here, so I would just like to remind you, while I'm in here, don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and tap that bell icon to get notified whenever I upload. And as always, thank you all for watching. Bye.
Okay, right, come out now.
Come out. What did you say?
What? Guys, I can come out now. Guys.
Cool.